So about today's webinar, we're drawing on our experience from two major initiatives we've been involved in the last few years. The first is a 3-year national, what we're calling a model development pilot that took place in 3 school districts around the country. Kent, Washington, which is up near Seattle, Lamoille County in Vermont, and St. Charles Parish, Louisiana. And we have representatives from the pilot sites in Kent, Washington and Lamoille, Vermont, to speak to you today. The other major initiative that we will be drawing upon today, and you'll be hearing from the person, Margaret Sokup, who is leading that initiative in King County, is a major countywide initiative that integrates universal screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. We're throwing out the first acronym at you now. Please ask in the chat box if we accidentally say an acronym that we don't explain. You'll hear a lot about SBIRT today, so I won't talk too much about it now. But Margaret Sokup will speak to you third in line here in our panel, and we'll talk about this major initiative that's been going on in King County, where she's implemented SBIRT in 50 middle schools across 12 school districts in King County, an initiative there called Best Starts for Kids. My phone is ringing. And so what we intend to do today with this webinar is illustrate the core elements of a school-based mental health practice model that has emerged from our work in both of these initiatives. Just to introduce our panelists here in order of when they'll be speaking. I'm Evan Elkin, Executive Director of Reclaiming Futures. You'll hear from John Kidda, who is the project director of our national pilot that I mentioned, and is widely known as a national expert on restorative practice in schools, the author of a very important practice guide used in the Oakland Unified School District. We'll hear from Margaret Sokup, as I mentioned, who is the school-based SBIRT manager in King County. Bethany Turnbaugh and Mark Scott are co-project directors at our site in Lamoille County, and Bethany is the student services coordinator at Lamoille Union High School. And Mark works in a community-based organization called the Lamoille Restorative Center. And you'll hear more about what they do when they are up to speak. We'll also hear from Reverend Jimmy James, who is the project director for our Kent, Washington pilot site. His position is the Trauma-Informed Restorative Practice Coordinator at an organization called RAP Youth in Kent, Washington. And you'll hear from the Reverend about that organization and the exciting work that they do. Just a couple of words about Reclaiming Futures. Many of you joining may have heard of us or have been partners with us, but we started about 20 years ago with a major investment from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Since then, and most recently, our work is funded by the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, including the work that you're hearing about today was funded with a generous gift from the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation. Our work is, we describe it as being at the intersection of public health, justice, and equity. And originally, 20 years ago, most of our work was in the youth justice system, where we brought public health practices and a sensibility about equity and equal access to treatment, to alternatives to incarceration. And we've moved those concepts upstream, as many of the sites where we've worked with in the 22 states and in the tribal communities where we've worked, as many of our sites have also done, we've moved our work into school systems. We're going to hear about that work today. So when we talk about the intersection of public health, wellness, justice, and equity, we're really talking about these three commonly sometimes operated in silos in settings in the youth serving systems where you see these. Our efforts and this school-based model that we've created that we're going to be talking about today seeks to bring together these three elements of practice, kind of like a three-legged stool. And our feeling is that you can't really have one without the other two, or two without the other. It's a stool that can't stand on its own without all of these elements. So universal SBIRT, which we'll hear about, really means creating a universal public health practice of noticing and following up with young people about their mental health. Whole school restorative practice, in one sense, is about school discipline reform. Many of you may be part of school districts that have engaged in restorative practice based in restorative justice principles as an alternative to exclusionary discipline. We see a deep overlap between restorative practices, which are really about building relationships and building trust, between kids in the building, between adults and kids, as a way of creating an environment where there's an elevated awareness of how people feel and a trust. Without that, it's very difficult to do an effective public health initiative like universal screening. So those two are deeply intertwined. You'll hear about that both from Margaret Sokup and John Kidda in a moment. And community engagement is something that we'll talk about as a through line for all of these practices. So things to keep an eye out for during this presentation is the practice model that we're trying to illustrate for you today integrates a number of elements, practices and tools. First, a manualized version of SBIRT that we've created and evaluated. We created it originally for youth justice settings and have adapted it for both tribal youth settings as well as schools. And we'll be talking about a variety of tools developed by our partners and with our partners in collaboration at the Seattle Children's Research Institute, King County, Washington's Best Starts for Kids initiative that Margaret Sokup will talk about, and an organization called Ticket Health in Canada that developed a tool called Check Yourself, which is a really unique and powerful self-guided screening tool that we use in our practice and have woven into this practice model we're going to talk about. Other tools that we have that we won't go into too much depth to talk about, but are available and part of the implementation of what we're talking about are a practitioner guide for practitioners doing screening and brief intervention with young people in schools. We are developing an implementation playbook that includes strategies for schools and how to integrate the model we're going to talk about into other existing whole school initiatives like social emotional learning, positive behavior interventions, et cetera, and how to get ready to do that. So with attention to what are the elements to make your school or your district ready to implement these kinds of programs. We're also developing a quality improvement and fidelity monitoring tool, sort of a self-monitoring tool to help districts and schools understand how well they're doing and how consistently they're implementing these practices. So the practice model, as you'll hear, also integrates what we see as the best practice perspective on whole school restorative approaches, which to some are really a subset of the aspect of social emotional learning, which many of you are well aware of, that focuses on relationships and sensitivities to relationships and how to deal with conflict, et cetera. You'll see that we talk about community partnerships at every step of the way. And another important element to our thinking about this model is that we map it onto the multi-tiered system of supports framework that many schools have implemented. And even if you're not a school that uses the terminology of multi-tiered systems of support, the framework is readily understandable as the kinds of things that we do for the whole school and the things that we do in a targeted way and the things that we do more in intensive kind of fashion, the sort of interventions and responses that we make. So this illustrates how two of the elements of our three-part model kind of hang together. The public health and the universal screening and the whole school relationship building are considered kind of the tier one elements to the model. As you move up into the smaller circles, or sometimes this is represented as a pyramid, moving up to the peak of the pyramid to tier three, you get more and more intense and specific in the activities that you do associated with these elements. And engaging community partners in the building, in the community at every step of the way is critical to the success. So just putting this webinar in context, I think a lot of us have joined today for a lot of the same reasons. We know that prioritizing adolescent mental health and equity of access to care, to technology, to engagement with school is critical now more than ever. Reports indicate that rates of mental health problems, trauma, loss, substance use, and suicidality are elevated among youth throughout the nation, and that these elevations are not evenly distributed, that communities of color and communities of poverty are experiencing these things to a greater degree. Schools will reopen in the fall. We're fairly certain many have reopened already, at least partially, and will face this interesting dual challenge of re-engaging students they haven't connected with in over a year in a strong and meaningful way, but also meeting the needs of a very vulnerable and kind of recently increasingly vulnerable youth population. Big challenges lie ahead for schools. We know that many states are asking school districts right now to develop plans for mental health programming for next fall. So many of you on this call, and I know some of our panelists, in fact, are deeply involved in planning for fall to develop responsive mental health programming. So we're here to present this work in the hope that it might provide schools around the country with a viable and practical framework that you might consider, or elements of it, you might consider to help you meet that challenge. Our US Secretary of Education, Michael Cordova, this is a great quote recently from an interview he gave. Mental health services ideally will be baked into the DNA of schools as a core service going forward. So you see in this quote and in the amount of money mobilized for pre-K through 12 schools that mental health is a priority for the federal government. Of this $122 billion that's mobilized through states to school districts, about a third of that needs to be applied for. And schools and districts will be asked to create proposals describing how they plan to spend those funds. In the language of the federal funding from Congress, it indicates that federal funding is prioritizing, but not quite saying it's a mandate that schools fund programs that provide enrichment and emotional support. That's a term that you'll see in some of the funding language, and many of you have seen these documents already or are looking at the funding. But your state may take a stronger position itself in mandating the implementation of mental health programming. We'll be curious to hear from those. We haven't done an audit of all the states, but we have a pretty good awareness that a number of states are focusing very heavily on mental health for the fall. So back to this diagram here, showing the three elements to this model. I'm going to kick off our panel, where each of our panelists will address a component of this three-part model. We're going to start with John Kidda, who will talk with us about whole school restorative practice, its relationship to wellness and mental health, and just sort of what it is and how it operates in a school setting. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I think you need to request control of the screen. Or you can ask me to advance your slides.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces and names. And I wish I had more time with y'all. This project is obviously a big project with some big concepts. And so we're going to go through restorative approaches. So the first thing I want to just make sure everybody understands is that restorative approaches is not new. There are values and principles that form the foundation of this approach that have really been a part of most indigenous cultures the world over, and that they still exist. Restorative approaches doesn't have any sort of like ownership over these principles, but has kind of packaged them up in a way to form an approach and its practices that are based on them. So that is really, really important to understand, is that restorative approaches is not just a practice, but it's really based on values and principles. And so you can do elements of various restorative practices without having those principles at play, and the approach really doesn't work. So when we do express these values and principles at the start in relationship and community building, we form more of like a partnership rather than a relationship based on dominance or compliance. And then we can apply them when there are unmet needs and people have been harmed. So I want to get across that we're really using these values and principles in a proactive way first as a foundational building block to then focus on wrongdoing. So let's see if I can do this. I think I might need you to switch slides, Evan. So here are the principles as I've kind of conceptualized them. So it really starts and kind of exploring relationship runs throughout the restorative approach. So that's better understanding how we relate to the people around us and also to ourselves. A lot of the time I explain restorative approaches at its core is about creating the conditions for meaningful engagement for people to show up as their authentic self. That's easier said than done. It's pretty complex to create those conditions. And then a third component is providing agency and choice. So allowing people to shape and control their own lives without kind of feeling oppressed by a system. So they're having decision-making responsibility, and they are helping shape the climate and culture that they are a part of. And then the fourth is responsibility, or what I sometimes call active accountability. When things go wrong, a lot of our systems impose what I would call passive accountability, right? You go over there, you sit there, you get detention, you get suspended. Those are all passive forms of accountability. Restorative approaches are about active accountability, really understanding how your actions have affected other people and what you can do to make things right, to encourage people to move forward. And so I'm going to keep talking, but I'd invite you to, in the chat, if you want to engage in this way, to just talk about what comes to mind when you see these principles represented as cogs interconnected and connecting in this way. And we'll move forward to the next slide. So this is called the relationship matrix, and this particular version of it was developed by Dorothy Vaandering, but it appeared in a book written by Vaandering and Evans, the little book of restorative practices in education. And what we have here are two continuums. One, the continuum of support, and the continuum of expectation for being human. So if you have low expectation for being human and low support for being human, your relationship with the other person is not really, it's not anything, right? You may have power over them because you have the power to ignore them, right? So Dorothy says that this is really representing people as objects to be ignored. When the expectation for being human is high, but there's no real support being provided, we're often found doing things to other people. This is typically kind of a compliance orientation. It's where people are objects to be managed. And then in the blue box, we have high support but low expectation for being human. There we're often doing for people, right? This might be patronizing. It's people as objects of need. I am there to help you, therefore I have power over you. The restorative approach is really about doing with, and that's a critical piece, right? Doing with creates the conditions for meaningful engagement and is really a foundational piece of this pilot. And let's move to the next slide. So here's the pyramid that Evan talked about. At the universal level, we're really focusing on building community, creating a healthy school climate, developing social emotional skills. And this we find is needed to be in place before we effectively move up that pyramid to work on repairing relationships when they've been harmed, right? If you don't have a reasonably healthy climate, people may not want their relationships within that community to be repaired. So we have to have that foundational piece first before we move into effective restorative approaches on the targeted level. So when things go wrong, we're really focusing on repairing the relationship. We're focusing on identifying how people are affected and their needs. And we tend to need to do this with some people, right? Things only go wrong some of the time. Most of the time, things go well, and we can use restorative approaches to help things go well. Finally, on the reintegrative side, people become disengaged for all sorts of reasons. Unfortunately, our systems disengage people through suspension and expulsion, so we have to have a restorative approach to reintegrate them. Hopefully, we only have to do this with few. With COVID, I kind of added that bottom foundation with the need that we really need to reunite, promote equity and healing for all. So next slide here. Within the restorative approach, and this really comes from learning from circle process, which is a particular practice that is heavily used in the restorative approach, we want to have balance in the process, right? So we need to create time and space to get acquainted with people, even people we already know. So at the start of meetings or at the start of the day, we do things to check in with each other to better understand how we are right now in this moment. And then we intentionally do things to build understanding and trust before we dive into addressing issues. So you're going to hear about the SBIRT model in a little bit. And what our theory was that we really wanted to get acquainted and build understanding and trust before we have students or anybody fill out a screening tool, right? So you're more likely to get good, honest responses and people to really engage if you have used this balance in the process before. And then we move into developing a plan of action. And next slide. So this is really the why. Sometimes I start with the why. I'm gonna wrap up my piece with 2 slides on the why. So there's a lot of good positive research on school connectedness and the importance of it. And I think these slides will be sent to you so you can explore those 2 links at the bottom. The CDC has a fairly current website about the importance, and so does Child Trends, which is the Sachs article. And basically what we know is that students who feel a connection to school are more likely to come to school, they're more likely to do better in school, and they're less likely to engage in behaviors that we consider risky, and they're less likely to have kind of emotional problems or suffer from different issues. And that is kind of the why that we engaged restorative approaches in this pilot. Restorative approaches start with the relationship and building a connection and a sense of belonging to that community. And then the next slide is the outcomes. So this handout can also be sent out to you. So just highlights from that. We know from some good research on restorative practice, when it's been done well, we have found schools to effectively reduce suspensions and expulsions, reduce any sort of behavioral referrals, and when it's done intentionally to reduce disparities in exclusionary discipline, it's been seen to be effective at that. It's also reduced absenteeism and tardiness, but I think actually the other side of the slide is more important. We've seen students articulate a feeling of increased belonging and agency, again, having a role in creating that community that they are a part of. And as a result, their academic performance goes up, teachers are more satisfied, parents are more satisfied, and the social emotional capacity of students is increased. And that was identified, comes up in an Oakland study. So all the original citations are on that additional document. And I am going to turn it over, I believe, to Margaret. And feel free to post some questions in the chat, and I can respond in the chat, and we can get to them at the end too.
Thank you, John. Take it away, Margaret. You'll see, just a quick word, you'll see that there's a lot of common kind of objectives and outcomes associated with both restorative work and the kind of whole school public health work that Margaret is going to describe that she's leading in King County. And I think the overlap is will be clear as she talks about the work. Take it away, Margaret.
It's not letting, it says I have control, but it's not letting me move.
Okay, I'll advance your slides. Just
okay, thank you. Yes, thank you all. I'm really excited about the intersection of all of this work. And again, you've got your next pyramid. We have lots of pyramids to really talk about the integrated tiered system of support. And so if you see the blue foundation, that's really when your organization is really working on that vision. What is it that you want to do overall? How do you want the culture and climate to be in your school? And that might be a foundation of restorative principles and practices. And it might also be with a focus on really the whole child. When we're looking at this, when we build SBIRT, and I'm going to make sure you understand the acronym. So the SB is school-based, SBIRT, screening, brief intervention, and referral. 2, we have a big T, O, to services or treatment. What we know is most of our students don't necessarily need treatment, but they need something, some kind of connection, especially to an adult or some kind of an organization, tutoring. It could be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be treatment. But what our students have noticed through this process is they feel noticed. They feel like they're not a shadow and ignored in their school. So you've got the blue foundation of really kind of building that vision. And then with SBIRT, the universal screening, ideally, if everyone gets that, everyone gets universal screening. And from there, we'll identify those that may need something more. And I like to not necessarily use the word targeted with language really indicated. So everyone gets screening, everyone gets social emotional learning, whatever that foundation is for your organization or your school. And then through the screening, you identify those students that may need a little bit more. And that would be, you know, something that it could be a little bit of substance use. It could be some symptomology around anxiety or depression, but it's not just that. Well, through the screen, we're also identifying some of those protective factors as well. So when someone follows up with that student, which would be within a week or two, depending on your resources, you also want to talk about their strengths that are already built in. And then the few that need more, those are typically safety issues, suicide ideation, feeling threatened right now, not just bullying, but feeling like their physical self is threatened, and also self-harm. And that would be followed up within 24 hours, ideally. It's not always possible, but that's the focus and the best practice. Next slide. So this is the whole model of screening. We use Check Yourself as a universal screening. We have the best practice is to inform all parents, good communication, make sure that they're informed of what the whole project is. And the information would be given to the parents to opt out at the beginning of the year, which would be the best practice. And so those parents that don't opt out, that the student can opt out if they want to. So this is all voluntary. So using the web-based screen, the screen itself gives feedback. And then from there, on the back end of Check Yourself, the support team identifies those students that need to be followed up with right away, those students that may just need a check-in and a brief intervention that is scheduled, and those that may not have any risk factors. But what you'll hear from Reverend James with our Kent project is they identified those students that didn't have any risk factors, but they met in a group, in a circle, to talk about how that was for them. And so they still were able to process what it was like to even take a screen. And then that referral too, not for everyone, but if appropriate, they may need some kind of a referral. It could be just, again, what I talked about, tutoring, mentoring, and it could be a referral for an assessment if they may need further mental health support or substance use support as well. Next slide. These are the steps. There's a little bit of organization. I think a lot of folks think, oh, you know, you find a screen and you're ready to screen. There's so many foundational steps that go into that. And so it's really that preparation. You need support from the district level in schools. You need support from the school administration level, and then also the counseling team, the nurse. So it's really what kind of support do you have? And then also really dissecting all of the intricacies of FERPA and HIPAA, those legal kind of barriers or you know, things that you have to pay attention to, whether or not you are going to keep the screen itself as a school record. Implementation, just all of the details, and we provide training on that. What do you do before screening? Some of the schools are actually identifying just some of the language in the screen and doing some preparation around that. During the screening, how do you create a safe environment for students, making sure that their laptops or their phones are not in view of other students. And then what's the sorting and the triage afterwards? Who is identified and which counselors follow up with which students. And then the brief intervention. You identify what the brief intervention might be, and it may only be one brief intervention, and that communication is closed and the connection's made, or it may be multiple brief interventions to get to where the student wants to be as far as a referral. Next slide. This is just a snapshot of what is in our screen. Check yourself. It's the overview about me, demographics, health and safety, my stress and coping. And what's embedded in this is identifying again the protective factors and how the students are already coping with stress that they've already identified. And then we also have evidence-based screens built in inside the survey, and that's to identify anxiety and depression and suicide ideation. Next slide. These are the elements of the brief intervention. These are really clear, easy to learn elements of interviewing the student based upon the principles of motivational interviewing. I'm not going to go into each one of these, but there is a manual, as Evan said early on, to really break that down. And there's training involved and ongoing motivational interviewing training for the practitioners who are actually providing this brief intervention. Next slide. So this, what I want to talk to you today about is the data. We're in our third year of a implementation grant in King County. We're in 12 school districts. And what you're only going to see really is you're going to see some of our data from this year, which has been really complicated because we've been doing remote screening and brief interventions. Just recently, many of our school districts are back in person. And so I will touch on some of the data that we have for year 3, which is now, but we haven't been able to clean it all. So the N is really small. So I just wanted to give a little qualification there. So in our second year before COVID hit, we actually screened over 8,000 students. You can see these are, it's really small, but these are our different districts. The first year is in blue and the second year is in green. You'll see one of the districts that didn't move very far is towards the right. They didn't move very far because they did opt-in, which really did not create a universal screening. And if you want more information about opt-in and opt-out, we can talk about that in maybe later, or if you want to contact me directly. But really the efficacy of opt-out is the way you want to do this if you're doing universal screening. The other thing about this screen that I really love is that it identifies those protective factors. And so one of the questions is, when things are tough or stressful, what kinds of things get you through the tough times? And it really identifies what the students are utilizing in their own, within themselves, within their own resources to get them through the tough times. And it's hard to see here, but music is a big one. Some of the write-in, playing soccer, hanging out with my cat, acting, doing improv, but really trying to elicit from them what do they already have within themselves. Next slide. So the risk factors that this screen identifies is, and it's hard to see, but the red is that tier 3, yellow is tier 2, and we don't have the green, but the green is really, you can see it's more than half of the students really are not showing risk factors. Maybe the only risk factor they're showing in the green is maybe not enough sleep, and they get feedback on that about how much sleep they should be getting from the screen itself. And so the percentage of self-harm, suicide ideation, suicide attempts, bullying, safety, and then, or they just want to speak with a counselor right away. So this is the type of data that you're going to receive from this particular screen. So students who reported suicide ideation also frequently reported depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms, bullying, and self-harm. Students who reported anxiety symptoms also reported depressive symptoms, feeling angry, sad, worried on most days, and suicide ideation. Next slide. So something that we just wanted to talk about for this year, so we're in year 3 and the N is very small, so you can see so in year 2, our number 1 tier 3 symptomology or red flag was anxiety symptoms. That was number 1. 33%, bullying or harassment, 25%, and then suicide ideation, 20%. So that was when we're in person. Now that we're remote, the number one again is anxiety symptoms. Suicide ideation became number 2, and then self-harm became number 3. So again, the N's really small, and we're gonna have more because we've actually screened over 4,000 students, but we just don't have that data currently. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. But you know, the wondering around bullying and harassment is because they haven't been in person. Next slide. So of those 8,000 students we screened last year, almost half of them received a brief intervention. And 97% of the tier 3 and 92% of the tier 2 students received some kind of a brief intervention. It should be 100% of tier 3. And so we're trying to figure out what that data is about. Sometimes they are already in some kind of a service. And so they may not count that as a tier 3 intervention. Caregiving engagement during the brief intervention, most of the caregiver engagement happened with the tier 3, the self-harm concerns. And so that's really primarily where most of the caregiving or caregivers were engaged. And that's something that we will be working on. And I think part of the silver lining of doing remote engagement is that maybe we'll be able to engage more parents in the future because we're getting more comfortable with this Zoom meetings and et cetera. So we're hoping that we can really up our game in the tier 2 with pulling in caregivers to assist with whatever the referral may be. So you can see the referrals and referral connections. We had over 1,700 referrals provided to around 1,200 students. So some of them received multiple referrals. And so far in all of our data, even now, even with our small data, in 15% of the students that received the brief intervention received some type of referral. And so it's not as overwhelming as one might think. The top 2 barriers to referrals really were around long wait lists and lack of family supports. I'm seeing that what's the age group for the use of the screener? It's right now it's 12 to 18. And these are some of the referrals. It's really hard to see here, but the school counselor, in-school mental health counseling, those were the top 2. And you could see that a lot of the referrals are in-house to teachers, the social emotional learning class. And the ones that are, there are definitely referrals to community-based organizations, and those are just harder to make sure that there is a connection. So that the more that we can have in-house supports, the better for students. And one of the cool things around the screen is it asks about if some kind of connection with adults at school, and I'm having a hard time. So I can't even read it. Maybe you can, Evan.
Yeah, sure. So,
Yeah.
So at the top, that's probably readable.
Yes.
91% of students surveyed felt like their interactions around the brief intervention were good, very good, or excellent across all the categories. And the categories are feeling like you were allowed to tell your story, making you feel comfortable, explaining why the meeting is happening, being interested in you as a whole person, and talking about your goals. And really, this is validation for the brief intervention approach that we created. It's really meant to be collaborative and for the young person not to feel like they're the passive recipient of a screening that kind of spits out a diagnostic answer of what they need and pushes them in that direction. It's meant to be very motivational and interactive and really led by the young person. So we take this piece of data as kind of validation of what we set out to do. Thanks,
Evan. Thanks for being nice. So this is probably the coolest thing is so 52% of youth reported higher school connection after they participated in SBIRT. And And so showing after the intervention, just the fact that they felt more comfortable and more connected to school is something, because we also ask about their connections to adults. It's like, is there an adult that believes in you, that you can talk to? And so just knowing that our students are feeling more connected to school, which also, as John was talking about, is like the more connected you are to school, the better you do in school. Next slide. And the flowers that came out of the concrete is really the learnings that we've had through this remote year. It's been much of a struggle. And I think the biggest concern for folks is, what if we screen a student and then they have suicide ideation and we can't follow up with them? We've found that hasn't happened. And we've been able to follow up, and the remote screening that happened, they did it in breakout rooms. And so if there was a safety concern, they followed up right away in the breakout room, and they were able to identify a caregiver to make sure that student had support. This has been an incredible experience. Students are saying, thank you for noticing me. Thank you for asking these questions. It's been proven again and again to identify a lot of young people that have internalizing concerns, suicide ideation, and look really good. They're getting A's, they're showing up to school, they're not acting out. And so for those students, this intervention has done an incredible job of identifying people that really need support that otherwise would not get it.
Thank you, Margaret. So I'm going to turn it over to Bethany Turnbow in a second, but I just want to contextualize this a little bit. So Margaret's initiative is a massive initiative, 50 middle schools, 12 school districts. Many of them, in addition to doing this amazing SBIRT work, also implemented restorative practices along the lines of what John was talking about, or trauma-informed practices. And so there were sort of multiple initiatives at various schools. In our pilot, and Bethany and Mark are going to speak now, are the leaders of one of our pilot sites where we deliberately looked at the connection between these other types of initiatives like restorative practice and the public health practice of SBIRT to look for common ground, common goals, ways of integrating those practices to build this model that we're talking about. So Bethany and Mark are going to talk about a real life example of a school district who grappled with this and produced an integrated example of this model. So I'm going to turn it over to Bethany first, I think, or Mark.
Thanks, Evan.
Yep.
Okay, so part of my job at Lamoille Union High School as the Student Assistance Coordinator is to implement moments of intentional wellness into our daily lives. So I wanted to invite all of you to join me in a mindful moment to refocus and to recharge and just ground down as we enter into the second half of our webinar. So if you would like to join, get comfortable in your chair and sit up tall and place one hand on your belly and one hand on your chest. And depending on your level of comfort, you can close your eyes or just shift your gaze downward. And all we're going to do is take 3 deep breaths. And when you're ready, you can stretch or shake it out, and I will start. So Lamoille Union High School is a small rural high school in northern Vermont. 51% of our students have been identified as economically disadvantaged. Substance use, multi-generational trauma, and access to resources are some of our biggest struggles. We entered into this pilot program with the intention of exploring the root causes of a drastic increase that we were seeing with referrals to our opportunity rooms, so behavior referrals and suspensions, specifically related to physical violence, substance use, and bullying and harassment. Our assumption was that more was going on and we just didn't know what that was. So we wanted to take a look upstream. Our hope was to address the behavioral health needs of our students and families and to offer support and access to resources as needed. We wanted to create a network of supports built on a foundation of restorative practices and bridges to access those supports. Of course, COVID-19 added a whole new layer to this project. And the theme of this year has certainly been pivoting, flexibility, resilience, so much struggle, and a lot of growth. As a school, we needed to shift our day-to-day functioning and operate in several different ways. Check Yourself offered our student support team a place to check in. It was an access point for them. The foundational work of preparing for this project served as a safety net when schools were dismissed. We were able to use our triage team to make contact with every single student and every single family during the shutdown and used brief intervention as needed to support families and students and make referrals when appropriate. We created systems like daily check-ins to really foster those connections and offer a point of contact for our students. We noticed that COVID really highlighted the importance of the community connection, which Mark will speak about shortly. In joining with Reclaiming Futures, we hope to look upstream and offer interventions and resources, and in return, see a decrease in the behavior referrals and suspensions. We wanted to really look at our behavior practices and make a shift to a more restorative, supportive culture. We also really wanted to have a connected community of well-being with internal supports to fill the gaps and provide the much needed services to students and their families. So I'm going to shift to Mark, who will focus specifically on the foundational work of this project.
Awesome. Evan, can you actually go back one slide? No, the other way. Back one more. All right, cool. Thank you. Yeah, so at this point, what we wanted to just kind of do is, as Evan was highlighting and as Bethany was highlighting, we want to take a brief minute to talk about the foundational work that we had to embark on in order to make this successful. And so I want to put some timelines on here. So back in 2018 or 19, my organization, Lamoille Restorative Center, was beginning to work with the high school on implementing restorative practices. And then to provide a little context, the Restorative Center is a community-based agency, restorative justice agency, located in the same town as the high school. So we are neighbors. So we've worked with them a long time. So early in our work, or ever since I've been at the agency, our work with the high school has really been driven by individual students. We would often collaborate with students on their individual goals, maybe restorative conditions related to court or school engagement or independent living skills. So that was our main focus. But around this time, 2018 and 19, we began to expand that collaboration with Lamoille Union High School and the district to look more towards community building and shifting culture. And it's at that time where we became a partner to the school in things like professional development and like skills and concepts around student engagement. And also during the time when Reclaiming Futures started to show up, we were really trying to get a good grasp on restorative practice goals and creating buy-in along the throughout the campus about this idea of restorative practices and what it would look like. So I also want to take a moment to identify that there were some larger systems changes going on around the same time. And I think that's pretty important. So I was reminded yesterday when I was talking to my director about like what was happening when we were starting this project. And she said, well, remember around that time, the school board made a shift from having a safety committee to something that was a student and staff wellness committee. So I feel like this is really important to notice because it says that there's this larger kind of community shift to saying like, hey, maybe things need to change a little bit for us to better serve the community and the families. So to take a step forward then, when Reclaiming Futures came into the picture, it brought this increased interest in restorative practices, and a lot of that because it was connected to this universal screening idea. And as we started to think about this project, we began thinking about the training, the supports, and the community connections that needed to be involved in order to make this successful. And I know some comments in the chat that kind of reflect that same sort of anxiety that we were feeling. So what happens if we ask these questions, like, do we have enough support to respond? So this is definitely where the Restorative Center came in, because as a community-based organization, we already had many solid working relationships with community providers. And then we're able to leverage these relationships to get as many people to the table as possible. So one of the first things that we did with John and Evan's help was a school community event where we kind of launched this project and got all our partners together, and we got them all in the room, and we started asking them questions about, like, how do you see yourself interacting with the school and the school districts? What types of supports do you bring into the school? And what areas do we need to bolster if we're going to take this project on? And like, what are the things that we're not even thinking about? So again, this kind of reflects back to what Evan was saying about how this community engagement really had to be a part of the project from the beginning. So out of that larger project, we got a smaller steering committee and identified really 4 key components there. One was to develop a system of infrastructure to support SBIRT and RP in the school, restorative practices in the schools, establish a system of professional development around both these ideas, look for opportunities to include youth voice, and then just identify all those community sports that we could gather together. So this all happened around October of 2019 to the end of that school, and probably about December of that year. And then really that pivotal point in this project was actually when Bethany came on and joined that team. And she became that go-to person to help navigate all of these parts in the school. And so at this point, I think I want to turn it back to Bethany to kind of talk about what happened once she got into school and started like looking at these projects and pulling in all these resources.
Yeah, so the school-based SBIRT Check Yourself, it really expanded our view of our students, really peeling back the layers and allowing us to look through a more holistic lens and meet the needs of the whole student. We had some really great bones, like restorative practices being implemented at the Tier 1 level. We had an existing support team made up of our school counselors, our school nurses, our dean of students, our student resource officer, and our student support services coordinator. And we meet on a weekly basis. We also had strong relationships with our community partners. And I really want to emphasize this. Check Yourself is not just another initiative or another program. It truly was a driving force that strengthened already existing models of support and allowed us to use data to inform our programming. For example, we knew that our students were struggling with vaping and tobacco use. So we looked at our policies and procedures around this, and honestly, they were really quite punitive. So we started to look at alternatives to discipline. Simultaneously, we were looking at the data from the SBIRT, and we were noticing that a significant number of our students were struggling with signs and symptoms of anxiety and depression. So we wanted to turn away from the traditional punitive model, which would usually result in a 3 to 5 day suspension. And we thought, instead of pushing our students out, what if we pulled them in? So we started building layers of support. So instead of that 3 to 5 day suspension, our students are offered an opportunity to meet with our dean of students and go over policies and expectations that the school has for all of our Lamoille learners. They meet with myself, the student assistance coordinator, and I use the UNCOPE and CRAFT surveys to facilitate a conversation about substance use and risk factors. And we also look at their screener and look at those protective factors that they already have in place. And they also meet with their school counselor. And this really allows them to look at the bigger picture of what's going well and what areas do they need a little more support, or what areas do they have room to grow. And it also just fosters another relationship within the school. This new approach is still in development and includes educational opportunities and wrapping the student with support and access to resources instead of pushing them out. It really pulls them in. That's just one example of how we've used data to shape programming and shift to a more restorative and supportive models. I really want to highlight the importance of the relationship and screening. Margaret touched upon this. So we already had restorative practices in place, so our students were familiar with a circle model. So we decided that using circles to start and end each survey session was really important. So each survey session starts with students being involved in a circle, and each session ends with our students being involved with a circle. So every single student has a moment of brief intervention, which really allows for students to feel connected during the process, ask questions, and also have a voice to further shape the mental health and well-being supports that we offer at school. So all of our students engage in those two circles, whether they took the screener or not. So our students can opt out. It's totally voluntary. So even if they've been opted in, they can opt out when the screener is offered to them. However, we felt like including everybody in those circles was really important to allow a conversation to develop about the resources that are available at school. After those conversations, the students who've been identified as at risk, so either having a yellow or a red flag, are then invited into a conversation, the brief intervention. The process of brief intervention really empowers youth. It lets them be the author of their own wellness script, and it's focused on strengths and building on supports and fostering relationships within the school and community. This was our first year using Check Yourself, and it's been an incredibly valuable tool during an incredibly challenging year. Currently, Vermont is entering into what might be called a mental health crisis, with the need of support being higher than what is available. Using Check Yourself at the school level will provide us the ability to check in, to build relationship, to intervene, and to connect students and families to community resources and agencies. This is going to allow for the school to be a hub and also the heart of our community. And I'm going to shift back to Mark to explore the school and community relationship and how we fostered connection.
Awesome. Thank you, Bethany. So the school community kind of expansion and connection. Can I say, wow, this slide has lots of words and diagrams on it. It looked really different when I saw it on my big screen. So I apologize, lots of stuff on there. So again, it's just a diagram. So I do want to highlight that one of the benefits of this project with Reclaim Futures is the expansion of this work into the other school districts and into the community. So one of the things that came out of our work with Reclaiming Futures was this Here to Help tool. And it was on the diagram that Bethany just had. So it's a self-guided tool that asks about mental health and behavioral health needs and links the survey takers to services, but it is also a way for the school or the community kind of gather some information about what's really happening for people out in the world. And it's very we designed it in a way that it allows people to really have ownership over what happens. So they can request to have somebody reach out to them, or they can just say, I want to contact somebody else on my own. And it's really kind of a non-invasive tool to help connect people to services. So I wanted to kind of highlight how that work and kind of it all stemmed back from that initial meeting at the school when we got all the community members together and really started to talk about who's in the community and who is here to help the youth and the families. So we took this Here to Help tool, and during the process of creating this, I spent a lot of time checking in with community partners about what services they were able to provide and getting their input on the tool and the questions and then thoughts about where the use might be. And then throughout this conversation, there started to be this light in the community that said, this might be helpful outside of the school community. We have a larger community here. This could be really helpful out there. So there was this synergy that was kind of happening between the work in the school and the work in the community. And we were on these parallel tracks where we were looking at what's the best way to support the valley that we live in. And maybe there's a really good opportunity for collaboration. So this slide kind of demonstrates where the Here to Help tool and the information that Reclaiming Futures gathers falls into this larger continuous improvement kind of cycle that is housed out in the community. And so you see that the Here to Help tool is in blue and other data comes in this blue, and then it funnels into this reflect and analysis piece that's held by this group called LASROC. So that stands for Lamoille Area Health and Human Services Response Command Center. And so that's a very interesting organization that was born out of the COVID crisis, much like the Here to Help tool. And it is a collaboration of more than 30 local cross-sector organizations that partner together to share data and create a forward-looking vision for a more resilient Lamoille Valley. And so our work with Reclaiming Futures and our work with the community is funneling into this larger community effort. And you could see how it fits in, and then how the work that we're doing in the school ties into the awareness and action campaigns of the plan section of this. And then we are able to collaborate on stuff like professional development. Like, what does that look like for the professionals in our community? And are there things that we can learn from both the school and these community tools to bring really high quality professional development activities? And also looking at youth mental health first aid. We use our mental health centers to help train not only the school professionals, but also our community professionals. So we were really noticing that there's this benefit, and we were using data from all over the sides to help inform what we wanted to do. And so I just want to mention another thing. So I was talking to an individual in a leadership position on LASROC the other day, and he was mentioning that he was talking to administrators in the other 2 school districts that we work with, and really thinking about what are the ways that we can collaborate on re-engagement and supporting kids and families as they return to school. And I think that's really important, because it's really saying that this partnership is growing and people are reaching out to each other, not only around the tools and the information, but also seeing each other in relationship and saying we can really work together to change the way Lamoille Valley supports the youth and family. And so I just wanted to emphasize that with the Reclaim Futures project and all these tools that he brings, and then building that background has really has become a great benefit to our community. And I'm really looking forward to how we can move this project into the next steps and expand its reach, so more families and communities can benefit. And then just want to check in with Bethany to see if she had any other words before we turn it back.
I think we're ready to move to Reverend James.
Okay, thank you guys. There's so much food for thought here and such great work. It's been really exciting for us to see this model kind of come to life in Lamoille. And I'm thinking back to some of the questions that have flowed through the chat. And probably one of the most common ones is, do kids trust the process? And do they trust these tools, and do they answer honestly? And I think all of that is predicated on this preparatory work and a climate of trust and a climate of prioritizing relationships. One of the first kids that we met at Lamoille High School when we first visited was this young woman who was doing a school-wide project. I forget what it's called. It's one of their kind of senior projects on destigmatizing mental health difficulty in the school building, and how readily Lamoille High School embraced her efforts, and how that's the answer to the question, do kids trust this? They trust the process to the degree that they feel like they're being listened to. And so I think this is a living example. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end to answer some questions, but we're going to move on and hear from Reverend James, who is the project director of our Mill Creek Middle School, Kent, Washington pilot site. But also interestingly, that site is also part of the Best Starts for Kids initiative in King County. So has kind of a dual identity in both projects, and is one of the schools in the Best Starts for Kids project that has a focus on restorative practice and trauma-informed care, and as well as SBIRT. And so they were an ideal choice for us to kind of put some puzzle pieces together and help us articulate how these things hang together. So Reverend James, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Great, thank you. And I don't have a lot of slides like everyone else's, but I'm still going to ask Evan just to move up to the other slide. But first, I want everyone, welcome everyone. I just want you to take a look at the slide that we are showing right now. And as you can see, one of the main pieces that we really are excited about with our Reclaiming Futures pilot project is how all these pieces work together between the students, the school, the check yourself tool. All of these pieces work together with the work that RAP is doing, or Restore, Assemble, Produce, the work that we're doing and the work that we're doing with Reclaiming Futures that is really transforming and changing. It's been a process, but change is actually happening. So we're real excited about what's going on. We're at Mill Creek Middle School. The picture you see right below the Mill Creek logo is the actual principal, and he's very excited about the work that's going on with Reclaiming Futures, RAP, Best Starts for Kids, all together, us doing this work. He was a very proponent of making change in that school. And I'll give you a few statistics about that school, but we were blessed to actually have someone, a brand new principal who walked into the school who was able and actually ready to say, hey, I want the community to be involved. I want the community to be here at the school. Whatever type of programming is happening, he was for it, long as it was going to help bring some restorative justice, some of the attributes of what check yourself and universal screening, anything that's going to help the students. Now, that's some of the positive things. I wanted to just give you some of the statistics about why this is needed and why he was excited about participating and making a change. Just to give you a little bit about Kent itself in Kent, Washington. Kent, Washington is a small suburban city that's well, I'll say actually it's the 6th largest city in the state. It's surrounded by 2 large hills in a valley. We got the East Hill and the West Hill, and then the Kent Valley. But some of the issues, because of the gentrification of Seattle, Seattle is just like any other city, major city where they're experiencing gentrification. We have some reports, the crime rate in Kent is very high. Property and violent crimes is higher than the national average. 85% of poor families are living under the poverty level. Blacks, Hispanics, American Indians live at the highest poverty level. Children ages 5 to 15 live below the poverty level in Kent. It has 52% of the students in Kent are on the free lunch program. But just for Mill Creek itself, Mill Creek has a lot of diversity. 38% of the students are Hispanic, 19% are African American, 15% are white, and there's a significant population of Pacific Islanders and Native Americans. But 73% of students in the Kent School District are on the free lunch program. And one of the shocking things is that total amount of money spent per student at Mill Creek Middle School is the lowest out of all the 6 middle schools in the Kent School District. So that's just to give you a little bit about Kent and the community and the school that we're serving. And so what that comes with is a lot of issues and a lot of problems when we come to restorative practice and we come to exclusionary discipline problems and issues. We have a lot of our students, especially our students of color, who are have a high rate of suspension and expulsions. So one of the things that what RAP is doing is being part of the Best Starts for Kids trauma-informed restorative practices. And one of the emphasis on that is to address, say, trauma-informed. We're focusing, having a strong focus on racial trauma, and to understand, and this is where Reclaiming Futures come in with this project, of where we want to see how can the SBIRT and the Check Yourself work in line with the restorative practices. So we use a strong emphasis on addressing the racial trauma issue with professional development on bias, to understand, to help the staff and the teachers and the administration understand that all of this behavior isn't just because of whatever is going on with the child, and to let's make sure that we have a holistic approach to understand the impacts of racism and exclusionary discipline, that some of this, where's some of this behavior coming from? Why are these people, there's some things going on at home, but also there's some things going on in the school. So it was very exciting for us to work with the school, working with their staff, their behavioral interventionists regarding these different behaviors, and how we can work together with the universal screening. What RAP does, and with this project, RAP is Axios. It's very important for us to be there because of this population. And Axios is a mentoring program. We have a Voices youth advocacy program, Take Back Our Kids, with parent engagement. And I think this was a big piece right there, was community engagement. That was very important, that that an organization such as Restore, Assemble, Produce, one that was focused on the BIPOC community, Black community, and communities of color and the indigenous community, that was very important because of the population of the school and the high rate of exclusionary discipline. And also the parent engagement piece, to where the parents were totally involved in what was going on with the programming. So when we talked about the behavior piece and how we can actually work with the school, the principal being open to that, we're able to help the youth and the parents understand about IEPs and 504s, systems and policy change, have a say-so in restorative practices, undoing racism trainings, life coaching, racial trauma, but even so, and even also the COVID-19 impacts. All of these we were able to work together with Reclaiming Futures. I heard Mark talk a little bit about the Here to Help tool, and that was when the pandemic hit. That was a major piece of us being able to address a lot of the issues through the Reclaiming Futures Here to Help tool, that all of us sat down and we took a lot of time to work on. We made sure there was a sense of equity that was in the tool, and it made a major difference of participation. And I think that was why it's very important for a Black organization like RAP to be participating in this initiative, mainly because in our communities of color, trust is a major issue. It's a historical issue, and it's still a major issue today, especially when we look and see what's going on every day. We turn the news on, a lot of incidents are happening. So there's a major issue with trust, and what Restore and Assemble Produce was able to bring to the Reclaiming Futures pilot program and to Mill Creek, into our communities through our participation with BSK, was a trust factor, to where we were able, where the communities were able to say, even though they may not use some resources or were afraid or didn't want to participate, once they were able to relate to an organization that looked like them, that talked like them, that was able to show them care, to say, hey, we're not here just for a program. We're here to really to show you and let you understand and know that we are an organization and the people of care, that more and more people in that community became part of the programming, especially when the COVID hit. When the COVID hit back in March of 2020, many parents and community members heard about what was going on in our organization, and so many of these parents came to be part of what RAP was doing. But again, a lot of that was based off of how we were working together with Reclaiming Futures, how we were able to get that tool out, how we were able to work alongside with the school and as well with the school district on the check yourself piece, to where we were able to, as Margaret stated earlier, Restore, Assemble, Reduce was able to come in and do a survey with a lot of, with all of the young people who participated in the screening after the screening. One of the real exciting and important things that happened during that process when we were able to, we got most of our students were in the green area, and even though they're in the green, one of the things that we learned was that you can't always just say, oh, okay, well, these children don't have a lot of problems. What we find when we're talking to a lot of the young people one-on-one, when they come into our group circles, this is where that trust factor came in, they were really open up even more about what they might not have disclosed. And a lot of times we have to look and think and say, well, usually some of the students who seem not to have any problems, those are the ones that they may have that suicidal ideation. What we found with the COVID, some of our top students who made good grades after the COVID and all the issues with the school system, all of them began to fail. Their grades started going down. So there's a lot of stress, mental stress, and a lot of issues that were going on in the homes and in the families. And so during this COVID period, from the beginning to now, more and more parents are coming and participating and opening up about what it is that is really going on in their homes, and they're utilizing the tool. And we're finding we're able also, as Bethany stated, we're able to use this tool and this information to continue to work with our young people, working with the school, helping them not to just suspend kids or follow those processes, but yes, have a strong restorative justice approach about what's going on. One of the things I really like to do, if I can say anything that about what our kids told us that I was real excited about when we were talking to them, all of the kids, our students, our scholars, we like to call them our scholars, all of our scholars actually did tell us, and it was one of our questions, what did they feel about the screening? And all of them they were all nodding their heads. They were all agreeing with each other that they felt between the screening and the post conversation that we were having with them as rep, they really felt that they were being heard, and they felt that they had a sense of belonging, and that they were part of this, that the school cared about them. So they really appreciated the screening. It was something that really opened up in them to help them feel that they weren't just some students going to school, but the school was really concerned about what they were concerned about and what was on their minds. And so if I can give any example of what it really means and how it really worked, and how we work together closely with the school, closely with Reclaiming Futures, closely with our SBIRT processes, working with SBIRT and the MTSS team. We work the MTSS team, the equity team in the school. We would all these, the school improvement team. We're very engaged with the school and engaged with the parents. And so during the COVID, there was a couple of students. I'm gonna tell this short story, and then I'm going to turn it over back to Evan. But there was a couple of students who had some real serious major discipline problems, and the police was involved, and all other types of suspensions and expulsions may come in place. And we worked with the school district, worked with the school, and there was a lot of things that were talked about as some solutions, but the school could not get a hold of those young people, and they really did need to talk with them and the parents. And ever since the COVID, they lost all contact with them. And so one day they called Restore, Assemble, Produce and said, let's call RAP. Maybe they can help us out. Maybe they may know something. So they called and said, hey, we really need your assistance. Is any way you can get a hold of these students? Well, little did they know that while they were sitting there talking to us, asking for that, we had both students, both parents who felt like they couldn't go to the school district or go to the school. They came to our office, and they were in the office at the same exact time that the phone call came to ask if we could help. And both parents said, we need to come to help, somebody to help us, because we don't know what to do and where to go. And so we were able right there on the spot. We put up the Zoom parents with the parents and the child and the school district, I mean, in the Mill Creek School, and everybody was able to sit there and they were able to work out the solution, and those young people today are still in school. And so that's just an example of how the community working together, how the universal screening, the check yourself, how using all the tools and making sure that we're culturally competent, that we see our community as true partners and connecting together. But to watch the school and watch the parents were happy that they were able to connect with the school. To watch that happen was a testimony to how if we do work together and how effective these tools are in this pilot can make a major difference, not only in Kent, but I think school districts across our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. You know, I think that the hidden part of the story with RAP and also with in Lamoille with Mark's organization is the bravery on the part of the school itself to share power with an organization like RAP and let them in the school and let them be part of the narrative around what we mean by mental health, what we mean by justice, to let you lead these debrief conversations with kids who have gone through a screening so that they're able to articulate what they meant by what they said or what they didn't say. So I think it's all part of this continuous bridge between the practice itself and what the community health and wellness. And you really, in both instances, and in our third pilot site, which we were not able to include in this webinar, really brought that piece to life and really helped us to understand how important community in school and school as a bridge to community for all kids. And I think we take that for granted, that schools feel and want to be accessible to all of the various groups they serve, but it is not always the case. And letting RAP take the lead like this was an act of bravery by this principal and really paid off. So we have a couple of minutes. If any of the panelists would like to sort of add, if you've spotted something in the chat, there have been some questions about students trusting the process, which we've talked a little bit about, just the general buy-in. You know, how did you get buy-in, and the concern about resources? And this has always been the case with universal screening. It's like, what if we start asking questions and we find out the kids need help? That has been used as justification not to do screening. And I think that in all of our cases, we've had the moral obligation to move forward and build resources. And I don't know, Margaret, you held hands in 12 school districts as they all hesitated in some ways. What would you say to school districts contemplating a program like this?
Just do a small pilot and it sells itself. It sells itself. And I did put in the chat, it's like when we talk about universal screening, people kind of freak out. It's like, oh my gosh, we have 1,000 seventh graders. It's like, you don't do them all at once, because that would be, I mean, unless you have resources to do that, that's great, but most people don't. And it's just a classroom at a time, and you roll through it. And you do as many classes as you have resources to respond. And again, do a pilot, see if it works, and it sells itself, because you actually identify young people that really need you, that you otherwise would have never known.
Thank you, Margaret. You know, another thing that came up in Bethany's presentation that I think people might be wondering about is about the Check Yourself tool itself. And you talked about how it produces data, and we didn't really go into that. But the tool is both a screening tool responded to by the young person, a specific, kid-specific report is created, but it also aggregates information pretty readily so that someone making program and policy decisions like you, Bethany, can take a look at how the group of students is responding and make some decisions. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I can echo exactly what you said. The program that we use, Ticket Help, really makes it easy and accessible to access aggregated data, which allows us to really take a glance upstream and look at root causes and explore alternative ways to discipline, but also which programs need more supports, where our students are telling us that they might be struggling, or where they might be growing. the example that I gave with the our vaping and tobacco policy has really been an issue for a couple of years now, where we've seen drastic increases in our students vaping. That has, of course, gone down with COVID, but there are extraneous variables that really have impacted that. And looking at the data from our screenings, we're seeing we're seeing a relationship between substance use and mental health, overall mental health. And so, like I said earlier, you know, pushing our students out and doing that traditional suspension was only going to further the issue. We weren't supporting them. So it really allowed us to say, okay, we can't push you out. We really need to grab you and pull you in. We really need to wrap you up in supports and figure out what's going on. And so this is a maladaptive coping mechanism. Let's build on supports and let's learn some new skills.
Great. So a couple of questions came in from Janelle Nelson. So the question, how does the universal screening relate to Check Yourself? Check Yourself is the screening tool that we use for universal screening. Other tools are available. It's one that we like because it was sort of built around this kind of interactive, collaborative process. It has that fantastic ability to aggregate data and be used in the ways that schools use, kind of annual school climate surveys, et cetera. It gathers some of that same type of information, and it kind of does double duty in that way. And Janelle, you asked how you would explore implementing a program like this. Just get in touch with us. We have lots of materials and certainly tons of lessons learned now over 3 years and 40 middle schools down the road. We are here to help if folks are interested in learning more about this. So I want to thank all our panelists. You guys did an awesome job. It's so exciting for us at this point in the project to look at our lessons learned and be able to have data and present to the public. Is really an exciting place for us to be at this point. And looking forward to contact with all of you. A survey is going to go out through SurveyMonkey that Jim will send to all participants. And we hope you take a minute to respond, and we'd love to talk to you all soon. So have a great afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us.